Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to Watergate, Nixon's downfall. So this video is for both the A-Push class and the regular U.S. history class as well. So we're going to talk about what is Watergate, the impact of Watergate, and the end of Nixon's administration. Okay, so what is Watergate? What do they mean by Watergate scandal? Well, the Watergate scandal began on the morning of June 17, 1972, when several burglars were arrested in the office of the Democratic National Committee located in the Watergate complex of buildings in Washington, D.C. It wasn't an ordinary robbery, right? The prowlers were actually connected to Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, which was nicknamed Creep. Okay. And they had been caught wiretapping phones and stealing documents. Okay. And what ends up happening is that perhaps the cover up is much worse than the crime. So Nixon took very aggressive steps to cover up the crimes, but they were doggedly pursued by two Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who are still around and reporting on politics today. And they ended up revealing this conspiracy. Nixon ended up resigning on August 9th, 1974, because before he could even be impeached. And this Watergate scandal drastically changed American politics forever, leading many Americans to question their leaders overall, any leaders, and think more critically about the job, the role of the presidency, the role of the entire American government. Okay? So, imperial presidency is something that we had spoken about before, and mainly we go back to Andrew Jackson. And it's when the president basically thinks, acts, and behaves as if he is a king. Okay. And we saw that during a few times in modern history, right? We actually saw that probably going back to at least Andrew Jackson, 1830s, World War I, with President Wilson taking over the economics of the country due to the war. The Great Depression, okay, where we have the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt doing everything he can to get all of his New Deal plans through the government, attempting to even change the structure of the Supreme Court. World War II as well, right, with Franklin Delano Roosevelt and going into Harry Truman. And then the Cold War, okay, where the president is becoming more and more important, and maybe even more imperial, simply because of also having to make more decisions regarding foreign policy as well. Okay. Well, Nixon, he thought very little of constitutional checks. He impounded funds, which means he kept money away from people who should have received the money. So, for example, if states weren't doing what he wanted them to do, he would simply uphold the money. Okay. He slowed down basically. It should be desegregation. Okay, so we still have segregation in the South, going all the way back to Brown versus Board of Education, but in many places, still all the way through the 1970s, it was still a very slow process. Right? He was against busing, and what he did is he tried to make the desegregation happen as slowly as possible. This was part of his Southern strategy. Okay, meaning he was trying to get more conservative Southern Democrats to vote Republican now, because he was seen to be on the side of keeping segregation, or at least parts of segregation. Okay. And he also, as we spoke last time about, he invaded Cambodia without congressional approval, right? Part of the Vietnam War as well. Okay. So this is what happens. We have this inner circle of President Nixon. These men did whatever they possibly could to protect President Nixon. Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, and Dean. Okay? And these men are going to be mainly responsible for the cover up, right, of the break in and many illegal activities in the Nixon administration. And many of them are going to spend time in jail. And the thought is that they felt that they were above the law because they were Nixon's friends, Nixon's advisors, his homies, so to speak. Okay. And that Nixon believed he could do whatever he wanted because he was the president. And it was these men's job to protect the president. Okay. So as I started off this screencastify, right, is that early on the morning, June 17th, 1972, the Democratic National Committee, right, the office was in Watergate, a complex of many different buildings in Washington, D.C. And the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, wanted some inside information on the candidates, on the strategies that the Democratic National Committee would use to try and defeat Nixon in the upcoming general election, which was in November of 1972. And it was led by James McCord, John Mitchell, very powerful men. Okay. So you see here that this is November of 1972. Okay. And what happens, okay, let me move myself away here, right? So Nixon is running against George McGovern, okay, from South Dakota, right? And he gets blasted. As you can see, Nixon won 96% of the electoral vote in 72. But you also have to remember, this is also before or just at the start of Vietnamization, right? Before a huge blow up, but we obviously see that most of America, just about every single state, this is as red as you can possibly get, was in favor of Nixon, believing that he was doing overall a good job. Okay. So all of this occurs, the burglary occurs before the election, but obviously we don't find out really what's happened until much later after the election. And Nixon will not last for 4 years. Okay. So what happens is there is a major cover up. Okay. Essential documents are shredded. Okay. Now, there's going to be an investigation, right? The men that burglarized Watergate, right? They end up going on trial, they end up going to jail. But Nixon and his inner circle are afraid that these men are going to spill their guts and say, hey, we were working for Nixon. Okay. And so Nixon sets up a slush fund, a way to get money to these guys. Okay. And basically wants the FBI to stop the investigation. Says this is essential to national security. So he tells the CIA, one branch of government, to stop another branch of government from doing their job. Okay. Which, of course, is obstruction of justice and illegal. Okay. So he's going to pay these Watergate burglars to stay in jail 6 months, a year, 2 years at the most, and then hoping that this will just go away. But these two reporters, right? So here on the left, okay, are the actual reporters at the time. Woodward and Bernstein worked for the Washington newspaper. And over here is the book that they wrote, All the President's Men, and it became a very good movie with Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford. Okay. And so what happens is one of the guys that got punished for robbing the DNC or breaking into the building, right? He sends a letter to the judge that he was on trial with and said, I lied, man, I lied. And Nixon's administration knew a lot about it. Okay. So all of a sudden, all these guys, they either get fired or they start to resign. And this is the beginning of the crumbling of the conspiracy. Okay. So now what happens? Nixon comes on TV, right, and says, I'm going to get ahead of this bad publicity. Okay. And he calls for an investigation. Okay. But the Senate had already started their own investigation. And you're going to see there's going to be many investigations. The FBI is continuing to investigate. The Senate calls for their own investigation. Nixon's going to have his own investigation. There's going to be so many different investigations, people trying to find out what happened, that you will be unable to keep track of it. Okay. So what happens is John Dean, right, who was part of that inner Nixon circle, right, he starts to spill his guts. And he says, I think I'm the one that's going to have it all blamed on me. So if I'm going down, I'm taking people down with me. Okay. Now, what ends up happening is that a man named Alexander Butterfield, okay, people don't know who this guy is. He's one of the many aides to Nixon, but not part of the inner circle. And they start asking him questions in one of these investigations. And he says, well, Nixon has tapes. And they're like, what do you mean Nixon has tapes? Well, anything that he says in the Oval Office, anything he says on the telephone, he's recording for his own records, so that he basically is going to write his own book when he leaves the presidency. This is a bombshell. So now what happens? Okay. Let's see. The attorney general, okay, resigns, right, and fires his deputy. They refuse to carry out Nixon's order to fire the special prosecutor, Archibald Cox. So, this is what happens. The FBI, okay, is investigating. The Senate has their own investigation. Nixon appointed a man named Archibald Cox to run an investigation as well. Archibald Cox starts to take the investigation seriously and tells Nixon, I need the tapes. I need all the information. And Nixon's thinking like, well, dude, I just put you here to make it look like I was being serious. That, of course, if I'm asking to be investigated, then obviously I'm innocent. But Archibald Cox says, no, I'm here to do a job. Okay. And so what happens, they call it Saturday Night Massacre because all of these guys refuse to fire Archibald Cox. Nixon can't do it directly. And then so one guy refuses and then Nixon fires him. Another guy refuses, fires him. And finally, like on the third guy, whatever it is, he finally says, okay, I'll fire Archibald Cox. In addition, what happens is the vice president from Maryland, Spiro Agnew, he resigns because he was accepting bribes, going back to being the representative of Maryland, that he was taking all this cash, right, for giving out, I think, permits for government buildings and so on. One of the many crimes he committed. Okay, so he resigns. So now the president is obviously under attack. The president is in danger. Okay, and his vice president is gone. So Nixon picks Gerald Ford to be his new vice president. Okay. So here I just showed some pictures here, right? That basically what ends up happening is that President Nixon ends up resigning. Okay. Because Dean comes before all the investigative commissions and right, one of the inner circle, the an advisor to Nixon, and spills his guts, and he has this great memory, and just basically tells everything. Right, Nixon refused to send out his tapes. He's sued by the government, okay, his own government basically, and the Supreme Court says you have to release the tapes, okay, and the government, the House of Representatives says we're going to impeach you. So before he can be impeached, Nixon resigns, and here's his official resignation letter that literally is one line. I hereby resign the office of President of the United States. Okay. So to repeat, Nixon released the transcript of the tapes, but he did not hand over the actual tapes. And these transcripts means the typed out whatever was said or the tapes, right? It leaves all this stuff blank. It's obviously not completely showing the information. The Supreme Court says, no, we need the actual physical tapes. The tapes come out. He must surrender them. He finally listens to the Supreme Court, okay? And he tells everyone, I'm not a crook. And he says, I want to let the American people know that their president is not a crook. Now, on these tapes, which you can go on YouTube and watch, there's hundreds of hours, okay? The tapes are the smoking gun that he might not have known about the initial break-in, but what he did is he was able to illegally get money that were supposed to be for him as reelection to pay these people off. We know that he also told the CIA to obstruct an investigation into the FBI. Okay, so those are many of the crimes he committed, what we call obstruction of justice. Okay. So the impeachment charges are approved, meaning that it's going to go to vote. He never was actually impeached. It never got that far. The reason Nixon left is basically his own political party, the Republican Party, said, we will not back you up. You will be impeached. The Senate will put you on trial and will prosecute you, and you will no longer be the president if that's the route you want to go. So even his most ardent supporters said, we can't do it anymore. Okay. So here's a little timeline again, August 5th, August 8th. So you see all this happens in 74, in the summer of 74, when the break-in occurs in the summer of 72. And it was really due to much of the investigative work of Woodward and Bernstein, who also had an inside informant from the FBI who would literally meet him in underground parking garages, like at 2 or 3 in the morning, wearing a trench coat, a hat, dark glasses, and would give some information to Woodward and Bernstein. Okay, it literally was a movie before it was made into a movie. Okay, so we've come to the end of Nixon. Okay, and then President Ford is going to take over. Okay, so this is going to contribute to a huge distrust of Americans, right, regarding their government. Going back to Vietnam in the 1960s, okay, and then we have the lying about the Pentagon Papers. We have the invasion of Cambodia, the lie of that, okay, and then we have Watergate. It will continue with the next president in the 80s, Ronald Reagan, the Iran-Contra affair. In the 90s with Bill Clinton and the Monica Lewinsky affair. So America has really changed its viewpoint in not putting presidents on a pedestal, meaning that the presidents can do no wrong. Okay, that America looks much more deeper into the activities of the government. Okay, talk to you later. Bye.